we've had some histories, right? And also, the way those histories are kind of perceived and written about isn't really nice. And so being able to be sovereign from those institutions and systems, I won't, point to any institutions, but I think we kind of know which ones are not, let's say, value adding, right? We've seen them operate for 50 years and nothing is better because of them, right? So it's time to look at some alternative solutions, and Bitcoin happens to be, the one we're looking at today, and I think that's a good thing.
Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, where we explore the intersection of Bitcoin and progressive issues. I'm your host, Mark Stefani. My guest today is Kal Kassa. Kal is the founder of Bitcoin Birr and the Hoseki app. His goal is to bring Bitcoin to the people of Ethiopia because he sees it as a force for good in an environment where people cannot protect their wealth in financial instruments as inflation rises above 30%. Nor are most Ethiopians able to relocate with their wealth if the need would arise to flee the country. Kal is working on changing this with his initiatives, and I have no doubt he will be successful. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy this episode with Kal Kassa. Kal Kassa, thank you so much for joining me on the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I'm excited to be on your podcast, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. So let's get right into it. Walk us through the experience that started on June 29th, 2020, and ended with you in a backpack flying back to the US, and ultimately how that influenced your thoughts on Bitcoin.
Yeah, so June 30th, 2020, it's kind of become a historic day for Ethiopians now, but on that day, there was an assassination. His name is Hachalu Hundessa. He's a kind of a musician, activist. He's very popular within the Ethiopian community. And for, whatever reason, he was assassinated. And that night, we lost power pretty much early in the morning. A lot of us lost internet connection in the cities and kind of urban centers. And there were, for the next 3 or 4 days, riots, protests in the streets. There was, a lot of, pain within his community. So they kind of went out into the center streets. Some of it turned very, like any protest, damaging property and X, Y, and Z. And I live in a very central area. So, and without internet, there's not much I can do in terms of work. So I left, and things kind of, as things evolved within the Ethiopian, geopolitical situation, and, we had a lot of issues, especially last year. I think kind of the worst is over now, but during that time, it just, one, didn't make sense for me to be in Ethiopia at that point. Nothing was really open. There wasn't much activity. And two, the case for Bitcoin got really strong, coupled with COVID, right? And coupled with all of the things we've kind of been seeing in terms of kind of the international politics of it all. And on top of that, just the money printing that we see. And me physically leaving Ethiopia and, seeing how impossible it was to change my birr into dollar. And if I had dollar, I wasn't able to take that through the border. International transactions are very much monitored, right? So there's only so much that you can move, especially when you're in a country like Ethiopia with closed capital markets. So I was not able to take anything out of Ethiopia. I left with a backpack, Thankfully, I don't have too much wealth. There wasn't much that I had, but watching that depreciate is never a fun experience. And that was money that, I could have put towards better things, right? And so, I think by 2020, that event led me to become, I think, what I am today, which is, a Bitcoin advocate and a Bitcoiner.
So you were standing there in the airport with your backpack, and the thought occurred to you, how would fellow Ethiopians be able to do this with their wealth? You had the opportunity to obviously travel back to the United States because you have a United States passport, but your fellow countrymen, most of them do not. So was that the light bulb moment for you that allowed you to see one of the benefits of Bitcoin?
Yeah, yeah. And then, so I think that was like the catalyst, right? But then I kind of had to do my own research, and I had to dive into the books and to the podcasts, and just like everybody else's kind of learning experience, fail and go through even some misinformations before I got to, okay, this is how the protocol works. This is why it's open source. And then how do I? Yeah, I know you've been kind of tweeting about this aggressively, but like, how do I then add value to it, right? Because it's obviously going to do what it's going to do, but if there's any way that I can help inch it along forward, like might as well, do it, because that'll probably be a better use of my time than, what I was doing before, which was working for advisory firms and accounting firms and, places where maybe that value wasn't, felt as much, right? There's always going to be another, marketeer or developer or what have you, right? But, so yeah, over the course of the past 2 years, it's just become that where I was like, all right, well, I see the value in it, so why don't I support the addition to that value, right? And so we'll see how it plays out.
You've been focused on Bitcoin in Ethiopia ever since, trying to help other Ethiopians benefit from the same security that Bitcoin has provided you. So please tell us about Bitcoin Birr and your other initiatives.
Absolutely. So that just came about because of my competitive advantage. I speak Amharic, right? So I speak the local language. I lived here for the past 8 years. So, what's the best use of my time? It might be in kind of those legacy banking systems, because I do have some experience with that. But I think within a country like Ethiopia, there's so much that can be done. And with Bitcoin Birr, that's purely a kind of an open source education initiative. We're translating books, we're giving presentations, we're giving kind of open source content for people to learn from and for them to teach. I think it goes both ways. There's a lot for people like me to learn about in Ethiopia. They have their own markets, they have their own kind of price models and value methods and capital, right? So some of their investments and assets look wildly different, but they've made it work. So it's kind of it's education, but without the prestige of the education, right? I mean, there's no certification at the end. There's very little like model in terms of how we do it. The best structure I've organized for it is a 16-page presentation. It's more picture heavy than words, just because we're dealing with so many languages. So getting to the point of what is a node and what is mining and having and all of this is more important than kind of everything else that comes with it. So very bare bones kind of approach to teaching, and so yeah, it's been a good ride.
I'd like to talk about the economy of Ethiopia, and what I see is two distinct economies: those who have access to assets, those who have access to the US dollar, and those who do not. Can you describe for us that economy, that microeconomy of those who do not have access to banking and the US dollar, what they store their wealth in, and so forth?
Absolutely. So you might argue that 75% of Ethiopia doesn't have access to internet connectivity. They're usually in the rural areas of the country. And usually that coincides with a certain amount of, let's say poverty or neglect, or, definitely when there are fighting happening for resources and such. These are the populations that get kind of the brunt of those, disputes, right? So one, it's very hard to find them, communicate with them, transact directly with them. And they have, more or less no access to dollar. They have Ethiopian bank accounts, closed markets. So your only unit of account is the Ethiopian Birr. Unless you have an export license or import license, or kind of different passports like myself, or a huge investment license that allows for dollars, in the range of $200,000-$400,000, then you're not going to get the advantages that that I have, right? So I have I'm careful to say this, but I have advantages to your ecosystem, right? And my advantage is I'm an American citizen. Like really, that's my only advantage over the farmer in the city next door. So, and that's a terrible circumstance, right? When a piece of paper and not ability or competitive advantage separates the winners from the losers. So that's the economy that we have. And that's also the economy that a lot of other countries in the world have. So, the disparities might be more, or the standards might be lower. But I think, we've seen this in many countries too.
You've described livestock as, quote, better alternatives to the local currency. Is that simply due to the inflationary nature of the birr or other reasons as well?
So I use livestock within kind of the education because it's very tangible. It gives dividends in terms of milk and X, Y, and Z. So it's very easy to describe. And a farmer might think, oh, sure, I have, a plot of land, and that's something that, can utilize the grass and X, Y, and Z. But I think the lesson is that any asset, aside from the Ethiopian birr or the United States dollar, is a better investment. So, as long as it doesn't expire, right? I mean, you don't want to buy a warehouse full of milk and then it expires in 2 months, right? So, but land, machinery, any kind of companies, tangible or not, any shares of banks and X, Y, and Z, I think the Ethiopian economy understands that its capital is losing value at a high rate. So they are incentivized to invest in anything but the Ethiopian birr. And so, cattle or livestock is just kind of one thing, just because we have such a large amount of cattle and livestock and all of this. But really, any asset or any capital aside from the Ethiopian birr is probably a better bet. And I always make the case that even people are a better bet than the Ethiopian birr. I rather, hire, I don't know, an intern or like an assistant, right? Or someone that is kind of growing their capacities and kind of their skilled labor, lawyers, accountants, things like that. And spending your Ethiopian birr on them is a better use of your time and energy. Just because, in 5-10 years, they'll get experience, they'll get better at what they'll do, and they'll be able to command better rates in X, Y, and Z, right? So I wouldn't say cattle is the best investment, but, alternatively, it's better than birr.
And you've talked about the degree of inflation that the birrs has been experiencing over the past few years, and in turn, the price of livestock going up for a lot of these farmers. How is that in turn manifested for these communities?
Absolutely. So it's a very difficult thing because the number has gotten larger, and at the lower ends of kind of the socioeconomic class, you'll have people that eat less meat, right? And meat is a very healthy, I believe, kind of nutrient, right, and food group. And what happens when you start neglecting meat, right, in its kind of raw, organic sense is you might move on to other calorie sources or other food sources, right? And those food sources might be produced, manufactured, imported. They might be on the shelf for months at a time. They might be full of, the sodiums and all of this, right? The seed oils. And so, fortunately for me, I have access to dollars and Bitcoin. So I move on par with that inflation, and I can still afford to kind of eat, the most kind of healthy things available. But for a majority of the population, that's not the case. And you hope, alternative ways of feeding people exist, but really there's not. You have, good sources of meat, good sources of vegetables and fruits and, dairy if you're in, different communities. And so, we'll see how our kind of dietary makeup evolves and what changes. And you just hope that it's kind of the more natural options available.
You're forced to the cheaper, less nutritious, and quite frankly, bad food. And in turn, you're no longer able to afford health. And you're susceptible then in turn to the disease. I see that every day. And so that situation is very, very real for the Ethiopian citizens then.
Yeah.
So you've in fact described the dollar usage as illegal in Ethiopia. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is.
And your brother was in fact arrested for having $20 in his pocket
Yeah.
for the crime of using a better currency.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can get, allowances and licenses and permissions to use dollar, but that's not, the average person, right? So yes, for the average person, just kind of existing day to day, without any kind of large access to investors or, like I said, a passport, right? Social security number. It's not, allowed to hold dollars in Ethiopia.
One of the comparisons that I've seen emerge with your story is the similarity between financial aid that has been sent to Africa and some of the purported purposes of other crypto projects. So more than $1 trillion has been sent to Africa in the last 50 years. Between 1970 and 1998, though, when that aid was flowing in at its peak, poverty in Africa rose from 11% to 66%. And roughly 600 million Africans, were in poverty. And so we can debate whether there's malicious intent in all of that, but clearly there's this parasitic element of it in that $1 trillion clearly did not go to the people. It went to the government coffers. You have that experience. And then a few years ago, somebody comes in to tell you that we've got this new project that the Ethiopian people will benefit from. Immediately, your alarm bells go off. Can you tell us about your experience with Cardano and its trying to intervene within Ethiopia and how that moved you more towards a Bitcoin-only moral case?
Yeah, I mean, it was, for me, I had been following Cardano since 2018 when they entered. And, at the time it was kind of a learning opportunity. But, after about 2 years, there were, glaring errors, right? One, they had kind of been allotted into Ethiopia without procurement, tender, bidding, all of the kind of the public documents that you would expect from such a large project, right? So that was automatically a little concerning, right? And then the second one was, there was no detail as to what the deliverable was. There was no kind of strong agreement in terms of pricing or what the service would be. And so that all, gets a little concerning as well. And then, over the, next few months and years, I saw all of this PR and marketing grow in America, right? As it relates to what they're doing in Ethiopia, right? As if they're doing a great deal, right? When in reality, they have about 3 or 4 staff. They have, a small office. They're, not really even, collecting the data they say they're collecting, right? They're going into digital IDs and things like this. And then I think third, the most concerning, and this is why I kind of wrote the article, Shitcoin Millionaire. I dedicated some of my time and energy towards this, is, I really feel as though if a country does embark on digital IDs, those technologies should be built on open source technology, and the passwords should be saved at the state people level, right? And not the Cardano level in Australia or United States or Swiss or wherever they're registered. I think it adds more complexity and more failure points, right? When you have passwords stored abroad, right? If Ethiopia is a sovereign nation, then it should take custody of its own passwords, right? And so that was kind of my angle there. I think the Ethiopian government agrees. Past few months, they've made good progress with national ID. It's kind of a government program. And so they've started kind of doing census and ID building and all of this. And I think that's a better way to go.
And so again, you've been focusing on Bitcoin ever since. And I'm wondering what your priorities now are for bringing Bitcoin to Ethiopians. What are the barriers that you're seeing? Is it more than just education? Is there infrastructure such as the internet or hardware wallets that you're of concern as well?
Absolutely. And I think those are going to be kind of the secondary and kind of third layer applications that kind of get built and kind of, supporting that ecosystem as a whole. I'm interested now in showing the Ethiopian government how to take custody. And I want to see take custody of Bitcoin, right? And I want to see that education trickle down into all of the other facets of education. It's probably the most important tool that we'll have. The ability to send and receive Bitcoin, right? That's the education, right? In large part, right? We discussed the gold standard and all of this, but the heart of it is you need to take custody, you need to be sovereign, and we'll go from there. The infrastructure challenges, there are kind of private sector companies working towards that. I think as the government liberalizes more sectors and privatizes more companies, I think that'll be a good thing, more competition. The banking sector, I think will have no choice but to be innovative and to look towards things like digital currencies and Bitcoin. And I think if we do those things efficiently, we can then go into mining, right, and some kind of value addition projects, just because we have cheap energy, and then we'll go from there. So we'll see. Lofty ideals and objectives, but we'll see if we can get there.
Well, sure. Before we started recording, you were talking about the fact that you're in Ethiopia now, and you've had a lot of meetings with local officials. So, if to the extent that you can, please describe some of these interactions and how they've been.
Sure. So I'm not going to dox anyone, but just to see that the level of diversity. So I've had 160 meetings since I've got here. I've spoken to groups, in the hundreds at different presentations, lectures, X, Y, and Z. And the amount of the questions, right, have been amazing, right? I received questions about value. Like I had an artist come up to me and say, how do we add value? And it was just like the most, intense question I had ever gotten, right? His name is Chef Johannes. He's actually a chef, and he kind of works in that space, and he wants to work in technology. And then I received another question about, why is it important to back Bitcoin with energy, right? And these are the kind of questions that I took for granted, but working through the answer, she works more for kind of a non-for-profit, Birr, and her question, kind of got me into my own answers of, when you look at gold and when you look at oil as a store of value, they do store value because we assign a price to them, right? But also they hold within them a great deal of energy, like that's been built over time, right? Just as a resource, right? As a rock, as an item. And so, being able to compare that with the financial world, and have the private sector be there, government stakeholders be there, I think has been an amazing thing. And I think, in terms of adoption, I think we can say Ethiopia has, at least at a de facto level, at a people level. And I think the government stuff is going to take a little bit of time. But on the people level, there's a great deal of understanding.
Is there a characteristic of Bitcoin that seems to resonate the most within Ethiopia?
Anti-inflationary and sovereign. One, because we have inflation rates at 30 to 35%. I think now food inflation is 40%, right? So the perspective makes sense. And then also, Ethiopia is one of those countries where every now and then, for reasons unknown to anyone, it seems, it becomes a place of tension, right? The international media sometimes looks at it poorly, right? Not in terms of how we'd like to be looked at as a place for investment and tourism growth and harmony and salam, but we've had some histories, right? And also, the way those histories are kind of perceived and written about isn't really nice. And so being able to be sovereign from those institutions and systems, I won't, point to any institutions, but I think we kind of know which ones are not, let's say, value adding, right? We've seen them operate for 50 years and nothing is better because of them, right? So it's time to look at some alternative solutions, and Bitcoin happens to be, the one we're looking at today, and I think that's a good thing.
So I have to ask: is there any discussion about hooking up mining with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam?
I'm sure there are. I'm not privy to every conversation, but it seems like 2 or 3 people here are really aggressive in that. And have kind of proven some models and understand that the numbers will make sense, and have a history of mining in the United States. So I think any day now we'll probably hear about a project or some sort of initiative to kind of get that going.
How close are you to your goal of 10,000 Lightning wallets?
Pretty close. I think also like depending on how we measure, because I know now Cash App is interoperable with Lightning. So when I look at all of my contacts that use Cash App, right, and use the kind of Bitcoin legacy system, and seeing them, they will automatically be Lightning users, right? Whether they download a Moon wallet or a Blue wallet, they'll still be on that second layer, right? It'll be interoperable. So once you include those numbers, then it's well past 10,000. And so, yeah, I think, and you hope that everyone that I reach and touch and talk to shares this information with at least 2 or 3 others. So I'm always, kind of incentivizing that people, keep sharing within their own languages, their own dialect. And I think, it'll have great kind of exponential growth.
So you've said that Bitcoin, quote, works from any perspective. It just works. And I think what you meant was regardless of what's political ideology you come from, there's something about Bitcoin that benefits you. Why do you believe that? And do you think there's also a new paradigm by which we view the world under a Bitcoin standard?
Absolutely. Because look at the case that we're kind of experiencing in the past 3-4 days. And I'm definitely not an expert in this, but it's kind of nice to see all of the kind of the tensions and kind of discuss them for what they are. But the case of Russia and Ukraine, right? They are dynamically opposed to each other. One belongs to a NATO worldview. The other one belongs to kind of a, I would say a failed Soviet worldview, right? But they're at odds, right? And Ukraine and those cities are at the center of it, and they're both using Bitcoin. So it's just it's an amazing thing to me to where I don't think there's that east versus west anymore. I think once these things settle down, and I hope people will come to their senses soon, right? Both sides, and once that happens, I think what we'll have is probably they'll redraw some boundaries. They'll take some tariffs, and this is my land, this is yours. Maybe kind of a new barrier or border, if you will, right? West Germany, East Germany, kind of ordeal. But I don't think that's going to be lasting, and I think that's very physical, and that's very flawed, and that's very funny because people will be existing in online, right? And I think identities will be online, and I think money will be online. And the idea of borders will kind of be laughable at some point. And kind of these are just, the old dinosaurs kind of finding ways to spend more in terms of their military. But I don't think this is a genuine war that the people want. And I think this is probably, I would argue, created by the expansion of NATO. But we'll see. And I think whatever happens, Bitcoin wins. And I think that's the amazing part of the story.
In your presentation, you've said that Satoshi is Ethiopian. What were you trying to convey with this statement?
So I understand he's probably not, right? But when we look at the history of Halfini and kind of how it came about, you can probably say it wasn't he wasn't Ethiopian or he wasn't African, right? But I if I'm in the position of teaching, I want to teach little kids that that's why Satoshi was created, so they can kind of immerse themselves in the kind of open source ethos and do things on behalf of a community, right? And do things, as you've been talking about, for the betterment of the world, right? And it's very rare that we find ourselves in positions where we can do that, because I think your happiness and your whatever starts to plateau at a certain amount of food and resources and money, right? And after that, you kind of have to think deeply about, okay, what do I want to do with my life, right? What do I want to accomplish, and X, Y, and Z. And if we have the ethos of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Buffetts and the Mungers, the accumulation, I just don't think it's. I think it's played out, right? It was last century. We tried it. It's cool. Capitalism, love it. But I think now we're onto a newer level, a higher level. We can give it whatever name we want, but I think Bitcoin creates that new reality, and it's just going to be interesting to see.
So I guess I'd argue that if Satoshi is Ethiopian, then Bitcoin is Abibi Bikila.
Yes. Running barefoot through the streets of Japan and highly sovereign, strong, memorable. I mean, he embodies all of the great. So this is a historic day because it's Adwa for Ethiopians. Adwa is the day of our not independence, but the day that we fought off the Italians in the late 1800s. And so it wasn't the only time they tried to invade us. There was also a period from 35 to 40 where our emperor was in exile because of the failed efforts of League of Nations and collective security. And that's why, we have a very tough relationship with institutions because we saw that, the moment Poland fell, nobody stood up for Poland, right? The moment Ethiopia fell, nobody stood up for Ethiopia, right? And why are some countries more important than others is a thing I can never comprehend. But we've seen through Ethiopia's history that Ababa Bikila and all of our, runners and athletes are a great testament to our history and our pride.
My last question for you is, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is, I've shaken hundreds of hands these past few weeks, and I kind of feel like a little mini politician, right? Because I'm like advocating Bitcoin, and it's a funny position I find myself in because I'm a private sector guy, right? I've worked for advisory all my life, and now I see myself interacting with a lot of young people, a lot of people in their 20s, a lot of people in their teens, and they are really passionate about Ethiopia and about Bitcoin, and they know how to code, right? They understand the language. They understand why sovereignty is important, and they're very eager for what this new world looks like, where they have equal access to value in the world. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Because they are Satoshi.
Because they are Satoshi. It all comes back to Satoshi.
Perfect. Well, please tell the listeners where they can find you and your initiatives.
Sure. So I'm currently working as head of business development for Hoseki, hoseki.app. And we're looking to, empower the world with Bitcoin, right? And we're testing a few products, and I think we have kind of a good way to, place Bitcoin in a lot of communities. And so they can find me at Hoseki. They can find me at Twitter, bitcoinbirr.org. That's where I do a lot of the open source education. And I think this weekend I'll be giving a TEDx talk with Addis Katama and some Land Bank Development Corporation. It's a government office, and it looks like they will be taking Bitcoin. So I've promised them 2.5 Bitcoin. I think I found some funding to kind of finagle, and so as long as they're willing to take custody and hold a wallet, they will be the owners of 2.5 Bitcoin. So that's going to be something I'll be sharing on Twitter, and so everybody can follow the conversation there.
Fantastic. Well, any final thoughts? So happy to have you here on the podcast. Any final thoughts?
Thank you, Mark. Final thoughts, just, thank you for what you do. I, really love the title and the format of the show, and I really enjoyed a lot of the guests that I've kind of listened and learned about on your platform. And I think it's really important to have opposing worldviews come to some sort of concession. And I think even worldviews or opposition, I think, might not exist in kind of newer worlds that we can potentially obtain with true value. So I think it's really important to kind of define new worlds for ourselves, new mindsets, and not be bogged down by the kind of the traditional patterns. So I'm really glad your podcast exists.
Very much appreciate that. Thank you so much. Again, Kal, thank you for your time. I wish you all the best, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Mark. Have a good day.